If we turn our attention to Gaza and the conflict with Israel, one of the things that Trump has done is to basically cancel the aid to UNRWA because he is not happy that the organisation is as independent as it needs to be from Hamas. And secondly, his words are very strong about backing Israel and unblocking the flow of funds, as he sees it, to make sure that Israel is fully supported.
I think the timing of this one is going to be really interesting because there's been 15 months of war. There's a humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Depending on which metric you use, but there's almost certainly a majority of the buildings in Gaza are completely destroyed. Most of the hospitals are not functioning. The infrastructure, the water, basic needs are not functioning. And there's a massive flow of aid going into the country now, over 600 trucks a day, which it was less than 100 was the average, I think, for the preceding few months. The challenge is how do you get that aid, first of all, to the country and then get it distributed? UNRWA was the way that most of that was done. The World Food Kitchen, there are other organisations out there. If you suddenly take one of them out, what do you replace it with? And I'm not hearing that conversation. And the danger is, 15 months in, you could do what you like, but now it feels like all the taps need to be on full to pour aid in. Otherwise, the situation makes a bad situation even worse. And I think that's what the problem I have with this particular timing of this. But it talks to a wider issue as well. I mean, let's face it, he's also trying to put support behind Israel, but it's fallen off the news at the moment, hasn't it? At the moment, there's been massive hope around, the hostages are being released, that's the end of the war. I'm not sure. Phase 1 is underway. They haven't even started negotiations on what phase 2 is going to look like. I'm pretty sure Hamas will be recovering, regenerating its support at the moment. Israel will be licking its wounds as it moves out. Will it break down again? Almost certainly. Will that be enough to trigger a descent back into violence? Because the one thing that I haven't heard in any of Trump's announcements is what's that end state going to look like? What's the political solution? You're already hearing Saudi and the Emirates talking about they will provide the funding to rebuild Gaza, but only if there's a two-state solution, only if Palestinians can have the right of self-determination to provide them hope, prosperity, a future. None of that's on the table when you talk to Prime Minister Netanyahu. So there's some pretty significant blockages in the way. And I didn't hear anything from Trump that provided a positive story to that. The only one was, I'm not going to fund UNRWA. And you went, that's going to make life more difficult. It's not helping.
Yeah. Well, maybe there are other plans. Let's hope there are, because the aid is, who can possibly imagine what it's like to be there? And, individuals who are really not part of this conflict at all. And I think UNRWA have also cancelled, I think they have several aid routes, I don't know how many, you may be able to tell me, Sean, but I know they've cancelled the aid trucks through one particular route because basically Hamas were attacking them.
I think one of it raised an interesting issue because I understand exactly the same, that they're trying to work out. But if you've said you've destroyed Hamas, if Hamas has no role, then who provides the security environment in which aid can be distributed? Most of the charities that do it say it's not our responsibility to provide security. We're simply there to get aid and deliver it. And yet, we talked about before, there are reasons why Hamas might be wanting to get involved with military action to try and secure food for them. But also, if the situation is as dire as it sounds like it is, then a lot of people will be just desperate for their families and therefore will be trying to get aid however they can get it. And I think the situation is going to get worse before it gets better, because you and I have had disagreements over the last year about, the number of people who died, because clearly Hamas controlled. Gaza Health Authority used to come out with a number. A number of those would have been Hamas fighters. We don't know what the actual numbers are. But of course, with the war coming to an end. At the moment, more people are getting access to Gaza. And I've certainly seen several reports at the moment that talk about now that goes about the process of recovering bodies from under the rubble. And there's talk that, 10,000, maybe an order of magnitude more, will actually have not been accounted for at all because, Uncle Bob, we haven't seen him for a few months, but he's lost under a building because nobody could actually clear it and pull the bodies out. So I do think, there's a massive challenge in the Gaza Strip. Anything that compromises getting help, the first aid, that triaging people, getting aid to them, it doesn't seem helpful for this decision unless you've got an alternative in place, and I don't see it.
Well, let's see, and we'll get it on the next podcast.
Yeah.
So that's UNRWA. That backfires a bit also on the United Nations, which maybe we'll come back to. He's also reintroduced sanctions against the ICC, basically because of what he considers to be the perverse decisions they've made regarding senior personnel in Israel. All these things appear to be speaking to these institutions that have been around a long time. He's taken away, he's cancelled his membership of the World Health Organization, the WHO. The budget there from the US is like $1 billion per annum. Plus they've got quite a lot of personnel, up to 2,000 personnel as part of the institution. It's going to be a big loss. All these things seem to be pointing that he's sort of changing the baseline on how these international organisations work, or maybe return to their roots.
Yeah, it's been interesting conversations this last week because, you and I have talked about how the United Nations seems increasingly unfit for purpose these days. And there's a number of these other organisations that seem to have lost their way. And I suspect part of that is when we had the Cold War, we knew where the bad guys were, the good guys were. Ever since the end of the Cold War, a lot of these organisations have sort of grown both administratively, bureaucratically, but also idealistically. And there has been a view that America has been using many of them to influence nations far beyond America's shores. Now, America's always said, hang on a minute, how can you criticise the people who fund these the most? But of course, the critic would turn around and say, yes, because you're using it as a tool of foreign policy. I think if there was to be a positive that comes out of this, is that actually by America not retreating, but America saying America first and pulling funds from all of these organizations, it will actually reinforce their need to redefine themselves, that rather than being funded by America but trying to be independent, whereas of course inevitably if you're doing most of the funding, you're going to want to have a lot of influence in them. I think it might create the foundations of a much more pure United Nations, World Health Organization and the like, and take away some of the sting that Russia's always said, this is a US-led world. And actually it's extended to NATO as well. I think that's, again, if President Trump feels that NATO is seen as a military arm of America, that's not helpful. So actually, it needs to be NATO is just an organisation of which America is simply one of 31, 32 members. And I think it might sound like just flippant rhetoric, but the reality is I think there could be a positive that flows out of this in the longer term.
Well, as you said earlier, he seems to be rebaselining everything and giving himself the time and the space to do it. I think the World Health Organization decision is going to take a year to implement. That's relatively quick because they're going to have to make major changes. And if he then, so I think the other thing he's done, he's stopped all international aid for 90 days, and he's asking his team to check on the cultural alignment between the countries it's going to and how the money's going to be spent. Maybe some will get introduced. Actually, some might disappear.
Yeah, I think, you and I have spent a while sort of researching some of these executive orders, because at first look, they look incredibly disruptive and they look incoherent. Whereas if you look at them from a perspective that he's gone, over the last few years, America has sort of compromised in so many areas of our relationships with other countries. And over time, we've ended up being a net donor rather than a balanced arrangement where, we're prepared to support you if you're prepared to support us. And maybe he feels that balance. So by clearing the slate, he's very publicly rescinded, virtually everything that President Biden did. You watched in the inauguration when Biden was sat behind him and he was just stony faced because it was almost like his legacy was just being cleared. Now, it may be that that's a degree of petulance. I'm not sure it is. I think this is Trump just going, I've only got one term. I've got 4 years. I learned from what I did last time. I need to clear the decks and I need to reestablish America's position in the world stage. And actually, if I do that, there's going to be a natural benefit for everybody. They're going to feel it in their pockets and we potentially could reset America's relations around the world.
Well, I don't suppose Biden was very happy for lots of reasons. One is that as part of his own executive orders, Trump has also upended all of Biden's previous set, which must be very annoying. If that just keeps happening every 4 years, that's not great, is it? One particular one of those was a sanction. It was 14115, which is a sanction against the settlers, Israeli settlers in Judea and Samaria, i.e. West Bank.
Yeah, I think this is probably clearing the decks because what's fascinating is that the West Bank, the international, I've got to be careful here because we're on sensitive ground, but even Israel admits that some of its settlements in the West Bank are illegal. And it does appear, if you look at the maps over time, that gradually Israel's just gradually pushing the Palestinians out over time. And I think, President Biden, in an effort to try to just go, hang on a minute, Israel had made various sanctions, which Trump has cleared off the table. I don't think that necessarily means that President Trump is going to wholeheartedly support Prime Minister Netanyahu. I do think what he's doing is going, there is a negotiation to come. If you're genuinely going to solve the underlying problems of the Middle East, and that's what Trump says, I'm going to bring peace to the Middle East, then actually that's a really difficult job to do. And by clearing away some of the flotsam on the playing field before you start that conversation, I think it might make it a lot easier to conduct the conversation. I mean, you are an experienced businessman. Is that a valid approach for negotiations?
Sometimes it's just too complex to make progress in a business, and particularly if you're going to make major changes. And there's a phrase we have in business: sometimes you have to kill the previous business to get started and do something new, because it's just the claustrophobia that you get if you don't. It's just too great to make progress.